Please, for everyone, please wear your masks, and simultaneous interpretation is available in the room matter of the compassionate, the merciful.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Mohammed Al Nuaimi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you to a lecture titled Future Battlefields, Evolving Challenges for Humanitarian Action, to be delivered by Her Excellency Claire Dalton, the Head of Mission for the International Committee of the Red Cross in the United Arab Emirates. As the ICRC's Head of Mission to the United Arab Emirates, Claire Dalton represents the International Committee of the Red Cross in the country and engages closely with UAE authorities and other partners and actors on humanitarian issues of mutual concern. Prior to this appointment, Ms. Dalton pioneered the role of Head of Humanitarian Diplomacy at ICRC's Geneva headquarters. She has taken part in a variety of challenging initiatives in conflict settings, including Angola, Iraq, Darfur, and Nepal, as well as later with the ICRC's regional delegation in Nairobi, covering Kenya, Tanzania, and Djibouti. Today's lecture will discuss the humanitarian consequences of armed conflict, which has undergone profound change over the past century and a half, both in the way wars are fought and the impact they have on people. Urbanized conflict with multiple support relationships between states and armed groups is a key feature. The ICRC has strived to monitor the challenges of tomorrow, while the global pandemic has brought with it a further layer of complexity to humanitarian action amid armed conflict. And now I'd like to welcome Claire Dalton to talk to us a bit about her role and the ICRC's role. After you, Claire.
Thank you very much. It really is such a pleasure to be here today. I warmly thank the ECSSR for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure for me to come and talk to you today. Our relationships here in the UAE are very important for us as we work together on trying to improve humanitarian outcomes or deliver better humanitarian responses. So I won't say more about myself because I think you've done a very kind job of introducing me. But I will just sort of set the scene, I think, for what we're going to talk about here today. And while I'm talking, I think there are going to be some photographs from displaying the sort of work that the International Committee of the Red Cross does, just for you to have something to look at as well, aside from us. So thank you again very much. Now, my organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is working in about 100 countries around the world. We have about 18,000 staff, and our budget is around 2 billion. So we're quite a large humanitarian organization. Now, also, equally, a very important part of our work is ensuring better respect for international humanitarian law, because we are an organization that is working in war and conflict. So what is extremely important to us is, of course, our relationship with armed forces, military and security actors. And in that sense, we have dialogue with over 110 armed and security forces, and we also have dialogue with around 465 non-state armed groups, just to give you a sense of how we do work to ensure better respect of the law. And something that is very important to us, given the changing nature of war and warfare, is ways that we can work better to change behavior, meaning that the law is better respected, that people understand it, and that the behavior of armed groups, of fighters, of military, is also something that adapts over time. So it's a very important piece of work for us, and equally, the role of research in this is very key to help us understand better some of the different influences on all of these situations. Now, the ICRC, our aim is always humanitarian. We work impartially, we are neutral, and we do not take sides in any of the places that we are working. And that is a very important part of our work. Of course, it's very difficult too. I'm not going to pretend that that is something easy to achieve or do, but it's extremely important for us to be accepted by all the different parties to conflict, and that they see us as neutral, and that they understand the humanitarian nature of our work. Now, we work through the Geneva Conventions, as I mentioned, and we work very closely with states on this too, to ensure that they are able to meet their obligations under these rules. Now, I think today's conflicts I'm sure we all know, they're extremely challenging. There's a convergence of very many factors that make it even harder today to work in some of the places we're in than before. I think you've got a fragmentation and proliferation of actors in armed conflict. It's very rare, it's just state to state. You've got all kinds of different actors involved. I think you've got issues connected to the privatization of warfare in many contexts, not just a proliferation of groups, but a different approach towards the way wars are fought. The widespread availability of weapons also make this very challenging. And you've got high levels of criminal violence on top of conflict in many of the places that we are working. So it's, not a simple setting in that sense. And I think what we see is these, vicious cycles of violence lead to protracted conflict that goes on and on. For example, we've been working in Iraq for 40 years. We've been in Yemen for 60 years. We've been in Afghanistan for 33 years. This is not emergency aid. We are here for a long period of time, and these wars are almost endless in a sense, that there are no necessarily easy ways to end them and end this cycle of violence. And I think the impact of endless wars is catastrophic humanitarian needs, because people do not get a chance to recover. Their livelihoods cannot thrive, and these cycles put them under increased pressure, which on top of other factors, be that climate change, be that the impact of the recent pandemic, make the situation even harder, and the destruction of the infrastructure or the essential services people need to survive even worse. You also have massive displacement nowadays due to war and conflict. Across the world, you've got people on the move, which puts additional pressure on host countries, on host communities, and also on the communities who are fleeing themselves. So today, I'd just like to bring your attention to 4 issues that I think are particularly important for us to look at in today's modern conflict, or even towards the future battlefield. And maybe, we can discuss this too in the question and answer session. So I'll try and be as brief as possible. The first, I think, is the urbanization of warfare. I'm sure we're all aware of this. Wars are increasingly fought in urban settings, and so the impact of conflict is more devastation in a way, because in urban settings, many services are interconnected, the infrastructure is connected, it all interrelates, the water, the sanitation, the health. If these things are damaged irreparably, that is a very difficult situation, both for the civilians living in these cities, but also for reconstruction or, rebuilding afterwards. Something the ICRC likes to say is, of course, while fighting, you have to be able to think about the future. And maintaining important civilian infrastructure, it's, a rule under IHL, but it's also, I think, an imperative for all armed actors to consider this, because otherwise you will reverse any gains that might have been made. We see this in contexts where, for example, the destruction in urban settings, it rolls back years of development interventions. And so the situation, of course, is much worse than it was, and this continues over years. I think, when there's fighting in densely populated areas, and the cumulative impact of conflict on urban settings is extremely hard for today's actors to respond to. Humanitarian organizations were often set up for different circumstances, so we all have to adapt a lot to be able to work in these new urban settings. I think the second point is what we say today: nobody fights alone. Like I mentioned, there aren't really wars where there's just, 2 parties. There are many different methods and means, and so a lot of ways that war is fought, it's through partnered operations, it's through collaboration with different sorts of security and private actors, bond between states and different armed groups. And for the ICRC, we don't pass comment on who's fighting with who. That's not our business. But what we are interested in is the fact that any partnered operation has the chance to either reduce or increase civilian suffering. So of course we want the reduce part. So I think it's very important in these new wars where there are many different actors, where you see all kinds of hybrid warfare, you see all kinds of different methods and means used, that there is still a consideration of the law and that governments, non-state armed groups uphold their obligations under IHL with their partners, and that these things are also looked at, and we don't see a kind of reduction of responsibility. And I think that's for us very important, and why we will continue to engage with armed forces, security actors, non-state armed groups on this dialogue to find the best ways that we can work together to ensure that these kind of partnered operations do not increase civilian harm. I think thirdly, in addressing the needs of today, we have to look to tomorrow. I think we're all very aware of that, and advancing technology is giving rise to all kinds of new weapon systems that for an organization like the ICRC are really important for us to understand, because we need to understand the potential impact of these weapons or technologies on civilian population. One good example is autonomous weapon systems. What might this mean for civilians? They might be a very effective military tools in the eyes of certain militaries, but are they going to increase or reduce civilian harm? So the role of the ICRC here is very much to seek to understand that and to come with pragmatic recommendations for governments when considering these kinds of technologies. I think also we've seen the increase in things like cyber attacks. Often these are below the threshold of armed conflict. However, the impact on civilian infrastructure can be huge. So it's also something we talk to governments about. How can we regulate these things under the law? And how can we assure that the civilian infrastructure is protected? I think all kinds of new weapon technology pose three sorts of issues: humanitarian issues, the potential impact, legal issues, but thirdly, I think the important consideration too is the ethical issues of the use of some of these weapons. It's something that the ICRC is also talking to confidentially with governments about. I think the fourth area I'd like to highlight is, this, and it relates back to COVID, this global pandemic, I think, has shown us also new challenges, whereby in many places, armed forces or security actors or police forces are being asked in some way to enforce quarantine or to work in a way in a response to the pandemic. And this sometimes can be a challenge because it's outside mostly of a understood or agreed legal framework because it's so new. So again, the ICRC is not passing judgment on this, but rather we're trying to work with security forces, police, army, on pragmatic ways to support them when they are being asked to do this, and to we've developed a handbook that could help legally compliant operations in these sorts of situations that we're seeing now that's very new. A global pandemic that requires governments to take very difficult measures, and then what does that then mean for all actors? I think, what's very important to us is that we all need to work together to address some of these complexities, whether it's urbanization of warfare, the development of new weapon systems, whether that's the impact of things like a pandemic on the nature of the work that armed and security forces are being asked to do, whether that's the fact that, as I said, nobody fights alone. What's very important is that IHL remains central to this, and for the ICRC that we have a dialogue with all those who have influence on how to balance military necessity against the humanitarian imperative. And this is something we've been doing for 160 years. It's not always easy, but I think it's very, very important for us to have this dialogue. The International Humanitarian Law recognizes the use of force as a legitimate tool in armed conflict and just provides rules to guide the application of force. So in a way, we are working with military to support them to do that in whichever way we can. And I think the thing that the ICRC is always very aware of, and this you see very much in certain kinds of modern warfare, is what we call IHL exceptionalism, where governments or armed groups may say, oh, this doesn't apply to us. And we as the ICRC have to keep working to ensure that this kind of exceptionalism is not accepted, and that there is an understanding of how and where the law applies, and that the Geneva Conventions are as important today as they ever were. And I think we have to support our dialogue with very practical resources, and that's also where our relationship with different governments and military and security forces is so important, because it's there we can understand better the challenges that they face in their work, and that we can work together to find the best possible way to address some of these challenges to ensure that civilians are better protected, that essential infrastructure is not disproportionately damaged, and that in the end, the way that wars are fought doesn't mean that peace will be impossible to gain. We're not a peace actor, but I think it's very, very important that you have to think of these things on a continuum. The way you fight a war today is obviously going to impact how peace may be achieved and how it may be held. And I think also the importance of ensuring development holds during times of armed conflict is very important. We see that in many countries that we work. I mentioned that if you destroy essential infrastructure, the recovery from that is incredibly difficult and very expensive. So as an organization, as a humanitarian organization, we're continuously trying to work during conflict to ensure the stability and maintenance of essential infrastructure, so that it isn't, at a situation where it's very, very difficult for that to be repaired, or very, very expensive. And again, why do we do this? It's all about, the humanitarian imperative and the needs of civilians. So I think, in a way, I think that's 10 minutes. I hope that's 10 minutes.
That's fine.
And we take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for giving us a background on the ICRC and their activities and initiatives, the valuable work they're doing, of course. We've prepared some questions of our own here at the ECSSR before we move to the Q&A session where participants can partake. And I'm sure you're going to be able to shed some light on these questions. First one is actually on the ICRC works in obviously complex conflict environments, as you mentioned, and is challenged by a convergence of interlinked factors in its daily operations. So what do you see are the key challenges in today's conflicts, and what are the major humanitarian concerns resulting from these challenges?
I think, in a simple way, I think it is about the complexity of the environment we are all working and operating in today. Things change fast. Technological advances mean that often, everything's ahead of us in a way. So I think the complexity of what we face is really quite unprecedented. Equally, the needs are huge today. And I think I mentioned that. I think this protracted conflict where, people do not get a chance to necessarily recover because these cycles are continuous, mean that you see very, very difficult humanitarian consequences. And that's a challenge for us to respond. So I do think this impact of protracted conflict is changing our operating environment, because it's no longer a matter, even if it ever was, of going in, delivering humanitarian aid for a few months and leaving. Most humanitarian organizations are staying a very long time in the places they're working. And so I think this is a big challenge for us as humanitarians to ensure a more sustainable humanitarian impact over time, and also to be able to address immediate needs of people while considering what they may need in the future, and helping them not just to survive, but to thrive.
And so, many countries are turning to smart weapons, and you mentioned this in your intro. Smart technologies in warfare, reshaping future battlefields, and forcing organizations such as the ICRC to adapt their working methods. So what are some of the ways in which the ICRC will need to adapt to this changing environment of warfare?
It's a very good question. And I think, we've been trying to do this for 160 years, in the sense that over our history. You know, we were formed as an organization in response to a battle that our founder witnessed. And I think for 160 years, we've been trying to find ways to, you know, to do as you say. I think, you know, we also have to be ahead of the game on some of the potential, you know, either humanitarian, legal, or ethical consequences of any new weapon systems or means and methods of warfare. Now, I'm sure many of you know, the international community, for example, has worked together to legislate against certain weapons before they're developed. You know, there's a legal debate on, are these things disproportionate? You know, do they cause undue harm? ICRC is very pragmatic. We believe we have to work very closely with governments, whether that's bilaterally or through multilateral fora, to balance this need of military necessity against potential civilian impact or harm. I think it's like, you know, with the development of autonomous weapon systems, on this, we're not calling for an outright ban like we did with cluster munitions or landmines. Instead, we're saying, look, you know, governments, armed actors need to consider the implication of these weapons, and they need to be able to ensure that they are deployed and designed in ways that can always be anticipated. Because I think for us, the risk is, yes, if these things are not anticipated, maybe they'll cause unnecessarily civilian harm. And that's always what we're looking at, you know, from the bottom. So I think, you know, we have to be ahead of the game on some of the potential legal challenges, the humanitarian consequences, and also the ethical considerations. And we can't do that alone. So in response to complexity, I think it's diversity. So we need a diverse set of actors and supporters who we work with to solve these problems, because no one can solve them alone. And as an organization, that's why we're in a country like the UAE, you know, because we need to learn from each other and to find ways to address some of these challenges.
Great. And like veering towards the sort of the environmental challenges, let's say, you know, there was a release, a report released by United Nations, a climate change report in August 2021, found obviously humans unsurprisingly responsible for it, and warned that the world will face immense challenges in the future as a result. So what, in your opinion, are the key challenges posed by climate change, which the ICRC is set to build its capabilities towards and prepare for?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, you know, a few years ago, if I'm going to be very honest with you, I think that climate change wasn't seen as a humanitarian issue or a humanitarian problem. You know, that was for others. And I think we've worked very hard over the last couple of years to help shape that policy environment so it is clear that the impacts of climate change will be a humanitarian problem, because in a way you just see an added layer of vulnerability on people. You know, we see that in many contexts. You've got a conflict, and then it's, you know, escalated by climate change. Whatever that may mean, we can't comment, you know, on the science of it. There are other experts who can do that, but we can see the impact on people's lives and their capacity to survive in certain contexts. And I guess the complexity brought about by the layer of vulnerability you see that climate change puts vulnerable communities under, then you put conflict on top of it, it's really extreme. And you know, an example, recently we've done a lot of work in the Central African Republic. You know, people have experienced conflict and violence, and at the same time, they're experiencing the impact of changing weather patterns, of changing harvest, and it means that, you know, traditionally where communities might have moved from one place to another, they can't do that because there's now a conflict or there's something that's preventing them. And so all their coping mechanisms are not so feasible anymore. And I think as humanitarian organizations, we have to consider the nature of our response too. So it doesn't actually make the situation worse. You know, what are the responses we're giving? Are they geared to ensure people are more climate smart? You know, are we giving tools or aid that are, you know, not making the situation worse? So as actors ourselves, I think this is a very important thing for us to think of.
No, absolutely, and I think that segues into the next question regarding, obviously, water security. Growing demand for water worldwide has created further tensions between countries. In the Arab region, we see clear examples of this as water scarcity grows, affecting 5 billion people by 2050. It will play an ever greater role in civilian displacement and conflict. So how is the ICRC preparing for the effects of the water crisis?
I mean, I think very important here, and that, applies to pretty much all the questions you've asked, there also always have to be political solutions to many of these challenges. Humanitarian, all we can do is, the best we can to manage the response in some sense. But we always also say, yes, a lot of these wicked problems require, creative, innovative, courageous political solutions as well. And, if we can be a small part to help that, we can, but we're much more focused on the response. And I think, again, as a humanitarian actor, we need to consider the impact of what we're doing, particularly on water, and that's something we're actually going to be doing here more. We're going to open a water and energy knowledge hub because there's an awful lot of, potential partners here in the UAE and beyond, because I think we need to look at better how we are then working with municipalities to maintain water infrastructure. Are we ensuring less loss? Instead of looking at the demand side, we need to look at the supply. How can we as humanitarians, who are working often on maintaining or restoring water infrastructure, make sure that what we put in place is geared up also in this consideration, or when we're doing interventions, should we be trucking in water to refugee or displaced camps? Are there other ways we can work? I think the most important thing here is that, we take into consideration the environment we're working in, and we design responses that are geared to that environment, that take into account some of these challenges, the climate, water scarcity, and that we are, in that sense, part of the solution. And we work very much also on a policy level. It's not so much seen, but we're always working behind the scenes on these issues. Because as you say, I mean, these are also humanitarian problems, and very much in this region too.
No, we wish you all the best in those endeavors, of course. Now, moving on to the medical field, per se. So the integration of smart technologies in the medical field is accelerating, including medical relief, care, and health services, and applications. So setting up a comprehensive sort of ethical framework to reduce the potential risks of AI, or artificial intelligence, has become an urgent matter as a result, of course. So how is the ICRC using AI to deliver its services and enhance the humanitarian work it's doing?
I mean, like I was saying before, I think, we have to be ahead of the curve on some of these things. And as a humanitarian organization, we almost need to be able to think about the potential impact of any of these technologies. They offer huge potential. At the same time, as with everything, there is always another side. So as an example, we were looking at AI as a tool to help us with facial recognition when we are looking for missing people. A very big part of ICRC's work is to reunite families who've been separated because of war and conflict. That's often a hard job. In the past, and I did this in Angola, you'd have a book, with photographs of missing children, and you'd have to, give that to the family and say, do you recognize your child? It wasn't really particularly effective. You have to carry this heavy book. So now we're thinking, well, are there ways that we can use these new technologies to do this in a much more effective and efficient way? The answer is yes, but because also we have to consider the potential risks of some of these tools. Using facial recognition software, we have to be sure of the data privacy aspect for vulnerable people. It's different if you're, somebody not in a conflict environment without those risks. These tools are just great. But I think for people who are being displaced, for people who are in difficult circumstances, we have to be very sure that they understand also, what rights or what data rights they are giving away. And we have to be sure that whatever platforms we use are secure. So, for example, for the ICRC, we don't use Facebook platforms. Not because we don't like them, just because they're not as secure privacy-wise. And we have to be able to ensure the data privacy of our beneficiaries. So I think, we are very keen to use new technologies. I really do believe these would be the answers to some of our pressing problems. At the same time, I think as a community, we have to be very aware of what could be the potential risks so we can mitigate them. It's not to say, no, let's not use these, but let's find ways to ensure that we do no harm in some of these things. And it's the same with drones. We're looking very much into drones for humanitarian delivery, yet we have to consider what impact that might have and how effective those tools are.
Great. And obviously, I have one more question, if you allow me. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously has had an economic, health, and social impact globally. How will the ICRC help societies recover from the effects of the pandemic, particularly regarding the mental and physical health of individuals from diverse communities and ethnicities?
Again, a very good question. I think, something else we considered a few years ago, what do people consider emergency aid? Most of the time people say, oh, it's food, it's water, it's shelter. When we went and spoke to communities in the places we were working, we got very different answers when we actually asked them, what do you want? Often they tell us we want education, or we want some kind of mental health support. It wasn't really the classic idea of this is what humanitarian organizations are handing out. So we had to really adapt. And I think it's similar with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We really need to understand the needs of communities, their evolving needs, and how whatever we do interrelates with the ongoing situation that they face. I think we're all aware of that. I think the secondary impact of this pandemic hasn't necessarily been seen in many of the contexts we're working. The economic impact will be enormous in many, many places. And so people who were in a vulnerable situation before are likely going to be more vulnerable. So I think, again, we have to work with others to see how best to address this. Aside from the immediate health response, I think it is on this sort of the more secondary impacts of this. And also in certain places, where there isn't necessarily access for health care workers, or perhaps where health facilities aren't working or are damaged in many war settings, this becomes even harder. So I think we recognize the impact of the pandemic is huge. At the same time, we have to continue to work in a holistic way, to address all the different needs. And this is just one more on top of many others.
Well, thank you very much, Claire, for answering my questions, and obviously for the informative and interesting discussion we had.